There's a moment, quiet, devastating, when cinema stops being entertainment and becomes memory. Not yours, not mine, but someone's. Someone who was there, who saw the smoke curl differently than any scriptwriter imagined. When a young man realizes the landing craft door is going to open, who can tell the precise tone of fear in his voice? Hollywood, that glittering factory of illusions, has been honing the craft of the beautiful lie for a century, but occasionally something changes. A director becomes obsessed. An actor disappears into a role that might not let him back out. A veteran steps onto a rebuilt battlefield and feels the ground beneath his boots turn to 1944. This isn't a story about the best war films. It's a story about the cost of truth, about what happens when filmmakers stop chasing glory and start chasing ghosts, about the dangerous line between recreation and resurrection. What we're about to explore will disturb you, not because of the violence depicted on screen, but rather because of the circumstances surrounding it. Let's begin in 1962 on the beaches of Normandy. The war has been over for 17 years, but Darryl F. Zanuck stands on the sand with blueprints trembling in his hands. He's not making a movie. He's attempting something between seance and archaeology. The longest day shouldn't exist, not the way Zanuck envisioned it. Studios called him mad for insisting on actual locations, for hiring not one director but 5, each responsible for their nation's perspective in the invasion. British, French, American. Each viewpoint has its own truth. However, the history books fail to tell you the following. Zanuck mortgaged his house. His obsession caused his marriage to fall apart. He was unable to eat or sleep without thinking about the precise temperature of the water, the angle of the June morning light, and whether the consistency of the sand underneath the extras was what veterans recalled. He brought in dozens of D-Day survivors, not as consultants, but as participants. Men in their 40s climbing the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc again, their bodies remembering what their minds had tried to forget. No stunt doubles, no second takes for safety. For once, the Duke appeared out of place as John Wayne stood next to real Rangers. When President Eisenhower screened the finished film, he didn't say it was good, he said it was accurate. In Hollywood, that had never been the compliment before. That night, it felt like an epitaph. But accuracy has a price, and sometimes that price isn't paid until decades later, when another director decides to go even further. June 1998. A darkened theater in California. The first test screening of Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan. 27 minutes of Omaha Beach, handheld cameras, desaturated color, bodies in the water, men calling for their mothers. 3 veterans stand up and walk out, not in protest, in shock. One of them, a D-Day survivor named Dale Dye, would later say, "I wasn't watching a movie. I was back there. The smell was different, but everything else." His voice trailed into silence. Spielberg had done something unprecedented. He'd hired Captain Dye, a decorated Marine, to run his actors through authentic boot camp. Not the Hollywood kind with catered lunches, the kind where you sleep in mud, where blank rounds fire close enough to make you flinch, where you learn that exhaustion makes better performances than any acting coach. Tom Hanks lost 15 pounds. Matt Damon developed a 1,000-yard stare that never quite left his eyes during filming. The crew mixed the sand to match Normandy's composition. They studied how bullets move through water at various depths. They recorded the specific acoustic signature of tinnitus, that high-pitched ringing soldiers heard after explosions, and layered it into the sound design. But here's the detail that haunts me. Spielberg filmed the beach sequence in chronological order, which is almost never done. Why? Because he wanted real exhaustion, real terror, building over days. By the time they shot the final scene of that sequence, the extras weren't acting anymore. They were surviving. One medic consultant from the actual invasion watched the footage and broke down. "I thought I'd forgotten," he whispered, "but I remembered everything. The way the water turned colors, how heavy a body gets when you're trying to drag it. The sound. That's what Ridley Scott became obsessed with next. Not just what war looks like, but what it sounds like when everything goes wrong." October 3rd, 1993. Mogadishu, Somalia. A mission planned for 1 hour becomes 18 hours of hell. 18 Americans don't come home. 8 years later, Ridley Scott stands in a Moroccan street rebuilt from satellite photographs, declassified military intelligence, and the nightmares of survivors. Black Hawk Down isn't being filmed. It's being reconstructed, brick by brick, bullet by bullet. The actors, Josh Hartnett, Eric Bana, Tom Sizemore, trained with the actual Delta operators and Rangers who'd been there. Not for publicity, for precision. They learned how to move through doorways in pairs, how to communicate with hand signals when radio chatter becomes chaos, how to conserve ammunition when extraction seems impossible. But Scott went further. He brought several combat veterans to set, not as advisors, but as participants in their own history. One of them, standing in that recreated street, had to walk away. "It smelled wrong," he said later. "Morocco doesn't smell like Mogadishu, but everything else, the angles of the buildings, where the sun hit. I stood in the exact spot where my friend died. Except this time there were cameras. The film's most praised element? It's chaos. The way you lose track of who's where. How the mission objectives blur into simple survival." Military historians noted that Black Hawk Down captured something documentaries couldn't. The fog of war not as metaphor, but as experience. The Pentagon began screening it for training purposes. Not to teach tactics, but to teach truth. That even the most elite soldiers can become disoriented, terrified, human. But if Scott recreated the external chaos of combat, another director was obsessed with something internal, the silent pressure that builds in a soldier's chest when the shot is his to take. Clint Eastwood doesn't make movies about heroes. He makes movies about the spaces between the legend and the man. And in 2014, with American Sniper, he explored the loneliest space of all, the scope sight. Bradley Cooper gained 40 pounds of muscle, but that was the easy part. The hard part was learning to be still, to breathe differently, to understand that precision isn't about aggression, it's about patience until your body aches with it. Chris Kyle's widow, Taya, visited the set once. She watched Cooper in costume, in posture, moving the way Chris had moved, and she had to excuse herself. "It was like watching a ghost," she said. Eastwood's approach to authenticity was psychological. He filmed in long, unbroken takes. No dramatic music cues, no slow-motion heroics, just Cooper, alone with a decision, over and over, while the desert heat became real and the hours stretched. The film's most accurate element, according to military psychologists, wasn't the shooting. It was the aftermath. The scenes at home, where Kyle struggles to be present, where his mind remains in those Overwatch positions even when his body has returned. Cooper captured what veterans call the split, existing in two places at once, never fully in either. One SEAL who served with Kyle said the film's power wasn't in its battle scenes. It was in the dinner table sequence. That quiet, that distance, that's the war most people never see, the one that continues in living rooms. But what if the war you're filming isn't remembered by veterans, but by the earth itself? What if the battlefield is still there, waiting? Okinawa, 1945. A cliff nicknamed Hacksaw Ridge becomes a vertical hell where faith collides with fire. Desmond Doss, a Seventh-day Adventist who refused to carry a weapon, somehow saved 75 men under relentless Japanese bombardment. 70 years later, Mel Gibson stands in Australia with historical blueprints and a question. How do you film a miracle without diminishing it? The answer, you rebuild the mountain. Using original military topographical maps, Gibson's production team recreated the Meta escarpment's exact dimensions and incline. The mud wasn't just for show, it was mixed to match the photograph's consistency, making every step, every pull of a stretcher genuinely exhausting. Andrew Garfield trained with Army medics, learning not just how to bandage wounds, but how to make split-second triage decisions. Which man can wait? Which man can't? The mathematics of mercy under fire. But Gibson's obsession went deeper. He filmed much of Garfield's rope sequences in chronological order over 12-hour night shoots. By dawn, Garfield wasn't acting exhausted. He was genuinely trembling, muscles screaming, barely able to grip the rope. In one take, Garfield fell and genuinely injured his shoulder. Gibson kept filming. Doss was hurt too, he said later. If Andrew could continue, we continued. Surviving members of Doss's unit watched the finished film. One elderly veteran reached out to touch the screen during the rope sequence. "That's exactly where he stood," he whispered. "I was below. I saw him silhouetted against the fire. Mel got the angle right, getting the angle right." That became Sam Mendes's obsession. Not just accurate angles, but experiencing war in real time, without escape. Most films about war give you breaks, cuts, montages, moments to breathe. Sam Mendes's 1917 offers no such mercy. One mission, real time, no visible edits. Just you, running alongside men who might not survive the next trench. Mendes's grandfather had told him stories from the First World War, not of battles, but of journeys, of crossing no man's land with a message, knowing that minutes mattered, that every step through mud was a negotiation with death. To honor that truth, Mendes and cinematographer Roger Deakins devised a film that feels like one continuous shot. Actors couldn't couldn't pause for makeup. If they stumbled, the camera kept rolling. Because in war, there are no retakes. The production scouted English farmland that matched French topography. They built miles of trenches using archived engineering diagrams. Every sandbag, every duckboard, every inch of barbed wire placement was verified against military records. But the real genius was the emotional accuracy. By forcing actors to perform long, unbroken sequences, Mendes ensured their exhaustion was genuine. When George McKay sprints across open ground, gasping for air, that's real oxygen debt. When he stumbles and falls, that's real disorientation from exertion. Military historians praise 1917 not for its battle spectacle, but for capturing something rarely shown: the bureaucracy of war, orders delayed, messages lost, men dying because paperwork moved slower than artillery. One World War I scholar said, "This is the first film that made the Western Front feel claustrophobic and infinite at the same time." That's exactly what soldiers describe. But what about the war that happened in silence? The one fought not in trenches, but in the spaces between engagements. Desert, heat, boredom, fear that never becomes action. Sam Mendes returned to war with Jarhead, but this time he filmed the war inside soldiers' heads. Based on Anthony Swafford's memoir, the film does something radical. It shows combat troops who barely see combat. The Gulf War, from a Marine scout sniper's perspective, becomes an exercise in psychological endurance. Mendes recruited former Marines who trained the cast not in firefights, but in routines. How to clean sand from your rifle for the 20th time that day. How to fill hours with nothing. How waiting becomes its own form of warfare. Jake Gyllenhaal's performance captures what military psychologists call anticipatory exhaustion, the way readiness, maintained too long, becomes corrosive. The film's most accurate scenes aren't violent. They're quiet, men sitting, thinking, slowly unraveling. One Marine consultant said the film's greatest achievement was showing the alienation of modern warfare. "We trained for months for a ground war that lasted hours. Then we came home to parades for a war we didn't feel like we'd fought." Jarhead's authenticity lies in its restraint. No Hollywood climax, just the slow realization that sometimes war's greatest casualty is the soldier's sense of purpose. But in the mountains of Afghanistan, purpose was never in question, only survival. And one man would return to ensure that story was told exactly right. Marcus Luttrell shouldn't be alive. Operation Red Wings, June 2005. 4 Navy SEALs ambushed by Taliban fighters in the Afghan mountains. 3 dead. 1 survivor who crawled, bleeding for days. When director Peter Berg decided to film Lone Survivor, Luttrell made one demand: get it right or don't make it at all. So Berg did something unusual. He brought Luttrell to set every single day, not as a distant consultant, but as a living reminder of what accuracy means. Mark Wahlberg, Taylor Kitsch, and the cast trained directly under Luttrell, learning not just tactics, but the psychology of men who fight together. The film's most visceral sequence, the fall down the mountain, required actors to perform their own stunts across rocky terrain. Real falls, real impacts, real bruising and blood. Why? Because Berg knew that CGI couldn't capture the physics of a body in free fall, hitting rock and tree and earth. But the emotional accuracy cut deeper. Berg studied the actual radio transcripts, the communication failures, the agonizing decision to let goat herders go free, a moral choice that sealed the team's fate. Luttrell watched the final cut alone. Afterward, crew members found him outside, silent, staring at nothing. "It was like living it again," he finally said. "Every second, living it again." That's what Clint Eastwood forced his actors to confront. Not the battle, but what comes after, when the photo is taken and the truth is sold. February 23, 1945. 5 Marines and 1 Navy corpsman raise a flag on Mount Suribachi. Joe Rosenthal's camera clicks. An image is born that will haunt them forever. 60 years later, Eastwood tells the story behind that photograph in Flags of Our Fathers. Not the moment of heroism, but the decades of consequences. Working with Marine Corps historians, Eastwood rebuilt the Iwo Jima landscape using volcanic sand imported to match the island's texture. The flag raising was choreographed from multiple photograph angles and survivor testimony to recreate not just the image, but the chaotic seconds before and after. But the film's power lies in what it shows next: the bond tour. 3 survivors forced to reenact their moment of trauma for war bond rallies while their friends remain buried on an island most Americans can't find on a map. Eastwood interviewed relatives relatives of the flag raisers, uncovering stories of alcoholism, PTSD before it had a name, and the quiet guilt of being celebrated for survival. One historical consultant noted, "This is the first film that showed how photographs lie by omission. That flag was raised after the battle was essentially won, but in American memory, it became the battle itself. Memory. That's what drives Rod Lurie's obsession. The memory of men who fought in a place most Americans forgot. Combat Outpost Keating, Afghanistan, 2009. American soldiers stationed at the bottom of a valley, surrounded by mountains controlled by the enemy. A tactical nightmare that ends exactly as you'd expect. Director Rod Lurie, a West Point graduate, approached the outpost with military precision. Using declassified Army investigation reports, he reconstructed the battle minute by minute, radio call by radio call. The production built the outpost in Bulgaria using satellite imagery and photographs from soldiers who'd served there. Every building placement, every defensive position was exact. Why? Because in that battle, geography was fate. Lurie cast real combat veterans in supporting roles, grounding every scene in authenticity. The dialogue came from transcripts. The decisions, however, catastrophic or heroic, matched the official record. What makes the outpost remarkable isn't spectacle, it's clarity. In the chaos, you always know where people are, what they're trying to do, why decisions are made. That clarity, historians noted, is exactly what soldiers describe. Chaos to outsiders, but clear purpose to those inside it. Purpose, clarity, authenticity. But what if the truest war film isn't a film at all? Ken Burns didn't need actors. He had something more powerful. Voices from the graves, letters from the dust, faces staring from photographs that still carry weight. The War, his 2007 documentary series on World War II, achieves something feature films cannot. It presents testimony without interpretation. Soldiers, nurses, families, all speaking in their own words, verified against historical records. No reenactments, no dramatic music swells, just the truth, layered with archival footage that needs no embellishment. When you watch The War, you're not watching history, you're listening to it. And sometimes, that's the most authentic recreation possible, to step aside and let the dead speak. So here's the question that haunts Hollywood's most honest storytellers. Should we recreate trauma? Do we honor veterans by making their nightmares into cinema? Or do we exploit their pain for our entertainment? Perhaps the answer lies in the responses. The veterans who walked out of Saving Private Ryan in tears. The survivor who touched the screen during Hacksaw Ridge. Marcus Luttrell, silent and staring after Lone Survivor. These films wounded the people who made them, but they also created a different kind of memorial. Not stone monuments, but living memory, passed from screen to viewer, person to person. War doesn't care about authenticity, but perhaps those of us who've never fought owe it to those who have to at least try to understand. Not for entertainment, for remembrance. But here's something that will keep you awake tonight. There's one war film that historians refuse to discuss. One production so authentic, so disturbing in its accuracy that it's never been shown to the public. The footage exists. The veterans who consulted on it demanded it remain locked away. Why? Because some truths, they argued, aren't meant to be witnessed by those who haven't earned the right to see them. The question is, would you watch it if you could? Or is there a line where authenticity becomes something else entirely, something we should fear more than any fiction? Think about that the next time you press play.